Good afternoon and good morning to all those who are tuning in. It is such a joy to have you with us today. In this series, we are considering what it means to love our communities well in all their particularity and all their beauty, and to address crises of waste, soil degradation, water pollution, and land loss through a local lens. As we confront the environmental and communal challenges of our time, how ought we to respond? Well, Sir Roger Scruton suggested in his book, Green Philosophy, that rootedness and a love of home, which he calls Oikophilia, must be at the center of our efforts at stewardship, care, and reform. To quote Mr. Wendell Berry, it all turns on affection. Over the past several months, we've talked to Mary Berry of the Berry Center, to authors and farmers Gabe Brown and James Rebanks, and to theology professor Norman Wiersbe about their efforts to steward their places and to animate our moral imaginations and our efforts at placekeeping through a love of place and a love of home. Today, I have the great privilege of interviewing Sophie Scruton. Sophie Scruton worked with Sir Roger Scruton from 1999 to establish Sunday Hill Farm, a farm that brought together all their interests. While Roger gave lectures around the world building a network of followers, Sophie built strong links with farmers, conservationists, and local historians. The small farms surrounding Sunday Hill Farm, the Scruton family home, were struggling in the business of turning grass into meat and milk. The solution, they felt, was to turn grass into ideas and bring profit to the farm and to the neighborhood. Their project has culminated in the Scrutopia Summer School Program, where philosophy and friendship are cultivated. So we are going to talk for approximately 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. Please be thinking of questions that you would like to ask Sophie and add them to the Q&A box as we discuss, and we'll try to touch on those and address those as we finish our conversation. Sophie, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Oh, Grace, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you to Fisher and the Roger Scruton Legacy Foundation and to the Wethersfield Insitute led by Peter Budnick for creating this series and including me.
Well, it's a joy and a privilege to get to talk to you about the work you've been doing. The question we've kind of started each of these interviews with is this: how would you describe your environmental ethic? What values or principles undergird your vision of what it means to steward a place well?
Mm-hmm. I think my interest in the environment and the environmental movement came out of appreciating what I was surrounded by. And then it also came out of discussions with friends and colleagues of Roger's who were perhaps more urban-based about the things that they felt were really urgent to do with the environment. And suddenly seeing that if you have a farm or if you live in the countryside, you have an opportunity right outside your door to try and do things that will preserve and enhance it.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love too how much you have seen how beauty and affection really shape what it means to then seek to preserve and to conserve what you see and what you're surrounded by. So how would you describe your place where you live currently, the place that has helped inspire your environmental efforts?
Okay. I'm speaking from Sunday Hill Farm, and that's a small farm in North Wiltshire. That's in the south of England. It's in a distinctive part of the world on account of the soil beneath us. It's a heavy clay soil, which means that the landscape you see is one that is sort of the most practical type of response to this soil. In other words, just a grassland landscape with the remains of woodland features, which obviously would have been much more extensive many years ago. But still, it's compared to other parts of the county and the neighbouring counties, it appears to be a very green and wooded place that's really quite distinctive compared to areas around it. Not all of Wiltshire has this clay soil. Some of Wiltshire has the chalk soil that we know from the sculpted white horses on hillsides. I don't know if you've come across those. So again, when we think about Wiltshire, many people will have that image in mind, but actually where Sunday Hill Farm is this distinctive clay soil with the grass and the woodlands. How did you say, how did I come to?
Yes.
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 So obviously when Roger and I got married, which was in 1996, he'd already found the farm. He had been living here a couple of years. I think one of his jokes was that something along the lines of the opening of Pride and Prejudice, that it's a well-known fact that a gentleman, he said, in possession of a farm of 30 acres must be in want of a wife. So yes, and he had obviously left the city. He had discovered fox hunting, and he had discovered the joy of keeping horses and being outside all day. And he therefore put everything into trying to find a small farm, and that was why he wanted to settle at Sunday Hill Farm.
I think I have read in an interview that you did in the past that when you first moved there, the farm needed a great deal of work. So what did you move kind of into as you both began the work of stewarding this farm, and how did you set about transforming it?
Okay, well, Roger did the initial bit, which was to begin the process of making it beautiful. The farm had been started to get very run down. A lot of the activities, the pure farming activities, such as keeping pigs, had sort of been started and failed. So that was leading to a lot of disused sheds, not beautiful sheds, the most utilitarian sheds you could imagine. Turned over concrete, all sorts of muddles. And so Roger's first act was to sweep all that away, except for this one building, which I'm actually sitting in now. It's now converted into our room that we use for Scrutopia for the lectures. But previously it was a dairy, and Roger converted it into stables for the horses. So we kept this building, but the others were cleared away. And then when I first moved here, the attention was starting to turn to the land and how to restore features on the land that would again enhance the look and feel of the place, and ultimately deliver conservation goals. But I don't think those were the top priorities when we moved in. It was to do with getting it looking nice.
One thing I think we just talked about before we started is how much the work of conservation and of stewardship is a work of restoring beauty, and envisioning what it means for the landscapes in which we live to have that flourishing that exists when they are beautiful. And so I love that vision of starting with just the process of looking around and asking, what does it mean to make this place beautiful? So you have continued to partner with other farms and to do a lot of work at Sunday Hill Farm that is collaborative. And I'm curious what that process has involved, how you began to cultivate that collaborative and very communal work on your farm.
Well, always from the beginning, we were conscious of not wanting to sort of stand out, to be the newcomers who had a kind of bright new way of doing things. So from the outset, we were trying to talk to neighbours and find out how things were done, and obviously learning from them. And, you know, from that, we learned about how there used to be an orchard in one of our fields and other features that that we were not aware of. But in terms, more recently, in the last 5 years, actually following reading books by James Rebanks, whom you've interviewed, and another author, Isabella Tree, both of whom are very well known in England. I was reading both of their books, and I was thinking, gosh, a lot of what they are lamenting has been lost. Still, to some measure, exists in this part of the world here. This part of the world was formerly the Braden Forest in the Middle Ages. And because the land, the clay soil that I've talked about, is difficult to cultivate, features from the Braden Forest are still extant, particularly quite a few oak trees, so big mature oak trees of 300-400 years old, and the hedgerows that connect them. And so the more I read these books, the more I thought, I don't want what my neighbours have been able to conserve through their sort of light touch farming practices to be overlooked. I'd love them to get attention too. And so I started, and I also, it was sort of shortly after Roger died that I got keen to bring people together. And I thought, you know, he could do it in Eastern Europe, bring dissidents together to create an underground university. I really ought to be capable of bringing neighbours together to create a joint approach to where we live. So yes, from about November 2020, we started to meet, and we shared our knowledge and information. A lot of people were willing to fill out a survey form that I sent out to everybody, which it produces a fascinating record of how they've been farming and the changes they've seen in the sort of last 40 years. I tried to put a 40-year bracket around it, and people were only too willing to share what they knew. And I realized that that it makes a huge difference to people the more interested you are in what they're doing. And so, I mean, I could tell you more, but, you know, to cut a long story short, after about 2 years of working together informally, we managed to get through the hoops and hurdles to be recognised by by Natural England's Facilitation Fund as a recognised farm cluster, the Braden Forest Farmers. And I'm hoping that now we're a recognised cluster, we might be able to benefit from new schemes, new initiatives, as and when they come in.
It's fascinating to think about how much of what you are doing is both a neighborly effort, practicing what it means to be a good neighbor, and to come alongside each other, and then also the work of a historian. It's interesting that your neighbors helped fill in your vision of what used to exist here and are continuing to do that with this joint approach, and then ask the question, how do we bring it back? And it strikes me that this is both the work of a historian and the work of a conservationist, but perhaps we tend to neglect that backward-looking approach to what it means to steward a place. How have you found becoming a scholar of the past, asking these questions about what existed and how to preserve or to transform, to bring back those aspects of the landscape? How has that become a part of your work in this community?
Fun. Yes, you're right in sort of spotting that it's the history that has drawn people together. One of our most successful evenings was when we invited people to bring maps of their farms and to talk about the history that they recall, and it did people. Things like the orchards, a lot of the maps people brought over were actually sort of filled in with orchard trees or forest trees. And you could actually, from that, build quite an interesting pattern of how this landscape has been farmed and has changed. People also wanted to share place names with each other. One farmer who farms at Highgate Farm in Brinkworth, he said that he's got a field called New Zealand, and that field used to be common land, but it was so far away from the village that the villagers called it New Zealand. So you can see how the common land was distributed, wasn't exactly made easily available to people by big landlords who wanted to keep the best closest to themselves and send and offer the common land far away. So that was very interesting. And another local resident has found a map from the 17th century of the old road from Malmesbury, which is a medieval town near here, to Oxford. And it goes right through about a quarter of a mile away from this farm. And there are some trees drawn around the road, and it says Braden Forest, which, as we were sort of forming our identity, was very encouraging that this part of the world has had the identity of the Braden Forest from a long time ago. And now people are just sort of using shorthand, like, well, you know, in the forest, as if we really are identifying as the former Braden Forest. And I think it's sort of directing how people feel about where their place in Wiltshire is. Yes, so the history evenings have been the things that have really brought people together, and they've really enjoyed. And the more they come together, the more they feel that their work is worthwhile and their time on these farms is something that they can enjoy.
That's fantastic. My 3-year-old just walked in, and so
Good.
Just as a note, he might say hello in a moment. The one thing that you mentioned is that on your website, I think, is that you've done a lot of work restoring hedgerows to the local landscape. And so I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on why those hedgerows matter, and both the way that they matter to the local ecosystem and to this work of restoring the beauty of the past to this landscape.
Yes. Well, there are a lot of hedgerows on Sunderhill Farm as it is. It's like picture postcard sort of patchwork quilt look around here with the number of hedgerows that exist. But this area did suffer from people pulling out hedgerows, which was the trend between about 1960 and 2000, and well, and the 1990s, under schemes for greater production and efficiency. I think England lost about 75,000 miles of hedgerows in that time. And so here at Sunderhill Farm, we have put back 3 hedgerows, and we've done that by joining up the old oak trees and looking at maps. So it's quite an easy way to find the line as to where they should go. Hedgerows are sort of, I mean, if you read people who are really keen on seeing nature flourish all over their farms, they would practically say hedgerows are a paltry offering compared to what wildlife could be offered. But in an age where so much habitat has been lost, they are actually probably the most important feature we've got for wildlife. And there are a lot of schemes and a lot of charities devoted to encouraging healthy hedgerows. We've recently had a talk from a lady from the People's Trust for Endangered Species, I think it's called, who talked to us about why they are so important. I mean, they are habitats, food, shelter, carbon sinks, stop you losing topsoil. They do a great many things, and they also enhance your ability to livestock farm, because the animals greatly benefit from munching the variety of forage that a hedge offers, and from shelter, and from scratching and all the other things that a hedge can offer an animal. So in terms of animal welfare as well, they're a wonderful thing for livestock to have about them when they're out grazing. So really anything one can do to keep them healthy is important, and that means understanding their life cycle, understanding that maybe once in every 25 years you would cut and lay the hedge so that it regenerates from the bottom and stays thick. And in the meantime, you would trim it with a sort of soft touch. You just try and remember that once upon a time they were trimmed by hand. Okay, now we've got the big machines. But what you mustn't do with those big machines is hammer them too hard. You must cut a little bit higher each year, and ideally cut on a rotation so that different hedges are cut in different years, so that they all are on a sort of 3-year rotation. And that will mean they stay thick and strong. If you just let them go completely, you end up with a straggly bit of woodland, which isn't the same thing and doesn't provide the same protection for wildlife.
That is fascinating. And it's interesting. I read quite some time ago a book by Alexander Langlands called Kreft. And he's a British archaeologist, and he looks at medieval practices, everything from trimming grass to keeping hedgerows to the work of cultivating wool. And one of the things he pointed out with hedgerows that was fascinating was that not only does it provide this shelter for local wildlife, but it also tends to be a windbreak and a shelter for plants and for living things in certain areas of the UK. And so there was this really interesting and beautiful picture of shelter that he cultivated, and a work that humans partner with in cultivating and preserving this shelter in so many different ways. And so I loved reading about that on your website. The 3-year-old has gone. And so thank you all. And thank you, Sophie, for your patience with his bustling and happy presence. One question I had, kind of leading off of that, the work you have done as you look to the future and what you maybe hope to cultivate with other farmers in Wiltshire and with this Braden group over the next several years with the Braden Forest farmers. What do you hope to maybe accomplish going forward?
Well, at the end of over this winter, we've had so much rainfall, and village, quite a few roads and settlements have been flooded. We have started to try and think about this as a group of farmers. There are a lot of brooks running through this farmed landscape, and I was just reading something last night. Whose book was it? I think it was a book. It was a chapter by Robin Page. I don't know if you know who he is, but he started something called the Countryside Restoration Trust. He was a big personality on the TV here and writing articles for the Telegraph. And now, over the years, he very much noticed the sort of bad effects of some of our water management policies. So, for instance, on his farm, which is called Lark Rise, I think, in Cambridgeshire, I don't know, it must have been 30 years ago, they dug the brook deeper to stop it flooding onto the fields each side and to enable cultivation right up to the bank. And of course, what this means is that the water just rushes straight towards the rivers, roads, and places of settlement all the quicker. And what he was able to do, because he was a bold person and a leader, he completely went against that and started to bring back his water meadows and the special grazing and haymaking practices required to do that. And of course, that's a natural way of alleviating the problem we've got with flooding. It's something that the government wants to encourage, and it's something that if we can organise quite a lot of factors, not just the farmers, but also the local government bodies, the regulatory bodies, etc., it is something that the Braden Forest Farmers Group might be able to help alleviate, but it will be quite a challenge. Another thing we could look at doing is producing food that has our label, so that you know that it's provenance and the animal welfare standards that you could be guaranteed if you buy that food. Those are a couple of things that people would like us to sort of initiate.
Now, you mentioned that there are several of these efforts that the government is currently encouraging. I was curious how you have seen the British government seek to partner with farmers to preserve and to regenerate landscapes, and where you see that work achieving good things and where it might be failing or just struggling to accomplish what it ought to.
I think that the government is offering quite ambitious incentives to encourage biodiversity and nature recovery on British farms. I think that's involves quite a change for some farmers, and it's quite worrying for them. Although I think they're sort of coming round to it. But, you know, people are worried about, people question whether the policies are correct when obviously food security is another thing on their minds. But you can easily argue that in the other way that food isn't secure if it depends on a lot of inputs to create it. I mean, one of the interesting things from around here is that there are practically all the farms used to be dairy farms. We still have quite a few, but the ones that have really survived are the 6 organic dairy farms, because there's been a better price for their product, and they haven't had to put so much money into fertilizing the land and things like that. So I think that probably what the government is doing to encourage farmers to farm in a nature-friendly way is the right approach, and it's good that they're doing it, because the decline in species and things has been terrible. So a change is needed.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting to see, we talked to James Rebanks about this, and often the process of change on a farm is quite labor intensive. It can be, for a while, farmers can see a significant drop in profit. And so oftentimes having support in that season seems to be very important. And so part of that, of course, seems to come through local community and through neighbors in the way that you're doing. But it also seems as if when and where there is some sort of governmental support as well, perhaps it will help farmers make transitions that are very costly and difficult and take a long time to accomplish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I suspect that there is that support isn't really there. You sort of have to be, you'd have to be in quite a secure position before you change what you're doing. I mean, my neighbour who farms absolutely brilliantly to earn every bit of money that comes into the household from the farm. He hardly has time to stop dawn till dusk and make the changes, So it is quite hard to take a new course, and you do need support to do that.
Mm-hmm. Just as a quick reminder for all of our participants, thank you again for joining us today. If you would like to ask questions, please add them to the Q&A box at the bottom of our Zoom screen. Thank you to those of you who have already added some questions there. So one question I have as an American, we live in an area of the world where we commute almost every day. People often live very distanced, it seems, from their landscapes. People don't walk very much, or as much as they perhaps should, especially in certain areas of the US. How do you think, in a very uprooted and busy world, we ought to, or we can, cultivate a sense of place? How have you yourself come to feel that Wiltshire is home, and to build a sense of home there?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in terms of connecting to a place, walking is quite fundamental. And I think that people should seek that option. I mean, in England, we're very lucky, because in the countryside, you have a right of way over the land. So there are paths you can follow. I mean, paths that are marked, they're not actually laid on the ground, but with a map, you can go across people's farmland for a nice walk. And I know that is different in America. Private property is not accessible to other people. But of course, once you start walking, you also sort of pause and see things, and you can't help but start sort of wanting to know names and giving names to things. And of course, that's been a very important part of life here at Sunday Hill Farm. There are old names on maps for every single field. So we've got fields called Hanging Hill, Plough Piece. Plough Piece refers to post-war time when everybody had to put a little bit of land under plough for food production. Dolicher's Green, things like that. And then Roger was always inventing names as well. So he started naming the ponds. The first pond, which is rather muddy and unappealing, he called Iris Pond, because that's where Iris Murdoch swam when she visited for the weekend. And then at the top of the farm, another pond is called Dragon Pond, because obviously the children felt that it was such a long way away and mysterious that there surely must be a dragon submerged somewhere there. Yeah, so the farm has, names of affection, nicknames. And I think that even the farm itself, Roger called Sunday Hill Froome, a froome denoting something that you have to get quite anxious about and have to work on non-stop to make better. It's all rather calmed down now because I'm not so worried about everything working out. But there was so much to do that that was a name it acquired. So that's how we've made it homely, really.
That reminds me of Robert Macfarlane's book Landmarks. I don't know if you've read it, but that idea that language and names are so much a part of our relationship to our places, and that we need kind of this local language and understanding of place names to really even feel at home. Beautiful.
I guess road names often signify, and so even if you're in your car, you see names, don't you? And you think, oh God, Red Barn Road, I guess, where's the red barn gone?
Mm-hmm. Very true. And even family names oftentimes being a part of that as well. Yeah. One question we have from a participant is, how do your farm practices differ from a typical English farm? And if I may, what tasks did Sir Roger most enjoy on the farm?
Okay. This farm is similar to our neighbours' farms, but dissimilar to perhaps the majority of farms in England, which would probably be bigger and might be put down to arable land. Roger most enjoyed the work on the hedgerows. He learnt to cut and lay a hedge, and he learnt to identify all the different plants and look out for the birds and things. So yeah, he really enjoyed that. And of course, then to jump them on his horse. That's another advantage of a natural fence, that it produces that pleasure. In fact, he was very good at writing about the use of boundaries and permeable boundaries, and these jumps and stiles, which allow you to cross from your farm to a neighbour's farm, and therefore to think of your farm as part of something wider. Little thoughts like that have always made seeing a change in boundary extra meaningful and interesting when you're out and about in different parts of the countryside.
Another question, I guess, it looks like two similar questions kind of merged together. What are some of the obstacles or difficulties you encountered in building this farm partnership? What are some things you found particularly helpful in building bridges between rural folk, people who are farmers and stewards of land, and who might be cynical about new people or city folk, and people who want to support that work or become part of it, but who may initially be viewed with suspicion?
Well, one of the, I mean, there was much more enthusiasm for coming together in this group than anyone expected. And people were prepared to put in a lot of time making suggestions as to how it would work. They wrote letters and came to drop-in sessions, came to meetings. So I was amazed by the enthusiasm. And the people who didn't engage, it's not compulsory. So, that's nothing one can worry about, really. As things have unfolded, more people have joined, sort of see how it goes and then join. So I think it's taught me that, you've got to start. It is you've got to try things, and you've got to start them. And you've got to put the energy in. And if it doesn't work, well, it doesn't really matter, does it? But if it does work, it's absolutely wonderful. So yeah, there was a lot of enthusiasm. The second part of the question, sorry, can you tell me the second part of the question again?
Yeah, absolutely. Some things that were helpful in building bridges between rural folk and city folk,
Yeah.
people who steward the land and others coming in and wanting to help.
Well, had a lot of help from a young man who works at the county biological records office. He has 2 jobs, if not 3, but he's called Johnny Cooper. He works at the biological records office and Wiltshire Wildlife Trust. And he is extremely good at explaining his work and asking people if he can go and do survey work on their land. And he's created a very good relationship with people, and that's given them more confidence to let more work be done by outsiders and by volunteers. And so now we've got quite a few voluntary groups, such as the local Natural History Society, such as the RSPB, undertaking survey work in the Breydon Forest, because we do still have quite a few rare species. We have more farmers wanting outsiders come and survey their farms than there are surveyors. So it's actually, again, something that people want to feel part of and almost feel very proud of. And I think farmers are quite often quite competitive. And so, that was sort of part of the drive for production and efficiency. You saw their competitive streak there, who could get the most tons in during their harvest. Well, again, there's some competitiveness going on with who has a marsh fritillary butterfly or the great pinnacle that we all want is the curlewback, because there are a few left here, but most of them, wonderful birds, most of them have gone. So there is a competitiveness now, but it's directed towards what we've been able to record on our farms.
That's beautiful. I wish we saw more of that in my own Idaho farming community. I think we still have much of the former sort of competitiveness, and not a lot yet of the latter. Hopefully we can keep working on that. One question that we have is what grows on clay? That's the first question. And then second, do you farm organically?
So on clay, you really are limited to, well, it's better if you don't plough it, because you can imagine it's very heavy to turn over. But obviously, a lot of the livestock farmers here need additional crops to feed their cows over the winter. So some of them do plough the land, and they grow corn, sweet corn, maize, and that it's okay, but it hasn't always worked. Like this year, it got so wet so quickly, many fields weren't even harvested. So the whole process hasn't been very constructive, quite frankly, because they didn't even get the crop in. I mean, that's how badly suited this land is to, you might be able to grow it, but then you can't get the tractor on to clear it. However, I think James Rebanks spoke about monocultures in his book, English Pastoral. So although there's a lot of grass here because that grows best, but I think in the old days, there would have been more variety of crops for feeding animals. It's just we can go and buy it now from a feed merchant more easily. But I think, and I've spoken to some farmers about this, they said, oh yes, my father would have had the top field planted to kale, and other things like that. And so I don't think what we're doing now is by any means perfect. And I think we could get much more variety into the landscape than we've currently got. Yeah. Has that answered the question? It's a very simple question.
Yeah, I think so. Another question here is kind of more looking at students. Schools seem to shuffle students into careers for urban living. Do you work with local schools to expose students to these agricultural careers and lifestyles?
Yes, I'd love to work with schools, and actually did some training in order to have the children out at the farm, how to tie in what we're doing to their curriculum, because obviously school time is so limited that you can't just give them a fun day out and picnic. The teacher has to be able to say that, we were doing science or even literature or history or geography through the visit to the farm. And I found that the orchard was a really good resource for a lot of topics that would interest school children. However, it's very difficult to get school children out here because of transport issues and the cost of minibuses and things. So I guess I should work to fundraise to do that or something. As to careers on farms, I mean, we're still in a situation where mechanization and stuff means that the number of employees you need is quite small. And finding employees is also hard because the jobs you do want people to do, like milking cows, are terrible hours and, cold and messy. So not always attractive. But again, I think there are jobs. Most children aspire to go to university now, don't they? And there are quite a lot of jobs in agroforestry, and other land conservation areas that I think would be valuable and could lead to fulfilling careers. Perhaps not just on a single farm, but as advisors or surveyors.
One thing I wanted to note, just for the sake of the person asking the question, I got to give a little lecture on local history this last fall to a group of 14 and 15-year-old high school students here locally. And then we took them out to a farm that was in my book, Uprooted. That's a regenerative farm in which they are raising cattle and seeking to bring back diversity to this landscape. But the students went out and they spent the day walking in the pastures, learning about the process of rotational grazing, and then they helped harvest some things in the garden and help pick fruit from the trees. And they had a farm feast with roast beef and sourdough bread and fresh milk. And I think it was one of the most beautiful opportunities they've had to see where they live, and to experience it firsthand. And so even though none of us have any idea where they will be 8-10 years from now, I do hope, and I think it was an important and a beautiful opportunity for them to feel more connected to their landscape, especially in a very suburban area of the country.
That sounds absolutely fantastic. And it reminds me that opportunities for children, some children in schools who are identified as having special educational needs, one of the things that has been discovered to help is an outdoor learning environment. And a lot of children are attending things like forest schools here, and finding that their concentration and their engagement with the activity improves. You mentioned regenerative farming, and I remember now one of the questions asked if it was an organic farm here. It actually isn't an organic farm. Some of our neighbours graze some of the fields and they're not organic, so it didn't seem fair to turn our fields organic and then exclude their extra grazing that they can take. But this whole move for regenerative agriculture seems like a really, really good opportunity to improve the way we farm, with mindfulness about soil and soil health, which the organic movement has been pioneering. But I think that now that the regenerative doesn't have such high barriers and will produce good results.
Excellent. Another question for you. Who do you think is Sir Roger's successor within the conservative environmental space?
Oh, good question. I think the difficulty there is the conservative. I mean, I'd love to say, well, I mean, successor, or in the, people like James Rebanks we look up to so much, but he might not want to be called a conservative. Yeah, I think I'm so influenced by all Roger's friends who came before him. I'm not necessarily thinking instantly of the people who have taken up the mantle. I mean, many of these agricultural reforms we've been discussing were led by Michael Gove, the minister who had that portfolio following leaving the EU. And I know he read Green Philosophy and has tried to include some of the suggestions in his way of thinking about agricultural policy. And then, of course, it's people who are lucky enough to own a little bit of land who just are doing what, Roger would describe as oikophilia. They're sort of making it a very special place and enhancing it.
Yes, wonderful. I love this question. One viewer writes, I've got a copy of Helen Rebank's book, The Farmer's Wife, on my desk waiting to be read. I have it right here as well.
Oh, I haven't seen that one yet.
Yes. So they ask, can we hope for some similar future publication from you, Sophie, perhaps The Meta Farmer's Wife?
Oh, I love that. Thank you very much for the suggestion. I would love to be able to write a book. I don't know if I can. Writing seems to be a real art. that you do beautifully, Grace. Roger did beautifully. But it's not that easy to create to create something that you want people to read. But yes, a meta-farmers thing I could do. I've also thought of rather like John Aubrey's book of Brief Lives, a sort of little brief life sketches of all the farmers around here that I know. Because, of course, making a place is very much to do with people and the people you know in your neighbours. So maybe one day, not always a lot of sitting down time.
When you are doing as many wonderful and important things as you are doing, it is very hard to carve out that space to write and labor over a book. But I would love to read it if you ever do.
Oh, thank you.
So our question we've ended with each time is, what books are you reading right now? What is on your desk, so to speak?
Thank you. Well, I've just bought and read a little bit of the new book by Peter Wolbin, I think his name is, called The Power of Trees. His previous book was The Hidden Life of Trees, and it's a very imaginative way of explaining the life cycle of a tree. It kind of and with animals, I think you'd say anthropomorphizes them. He suggests that trees communicate or talk to each other, he might say, communicate through their root system. They either support each other or bully each other or protect each other. Anyway, so the new book, The Power of Trees, is proving very interesting. And I'm also rather proud of this. I've nearly finished this sort of the fire at the moment, James Joyce's Portrait of an Artist of the Young Man. So keeping up the interest, pulling off the good books off the library shelves here. And that's wonderful because it gives you an insight into Irish history, which I find fascinating, whereas Irish history is so complicated that if you don't access it through a route such as in the hands of a great writer, you might just sort of think it's too complicated to follow.
I remember listening to that book some years ago, and I was just struck by how beautifully it was written. His prose is truly stunning.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, now I need to reread it. And The Power of Trees. Thank you. I've gotten such interesting and wonderful book recommendations from each of our guests. And this one sounds like a fascinating book. Thank you so much for your time, Sophie, and your insights. It's been such a joy.